Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And what we do in these sessions, we're going to recap the news, the latest news from the solar industry. Then we'll look at what kind of events, webinars, conferences are coming up in the next couple of weeks. But then we try and highlight a specific item for that's of interest in the solar industry. And this format is essentially one where we have folks online. People will be watching this on video, but those people online can then give me specific feedback, interrupt, tell me I'm wrong, that kind of stuff. And then also hopefully ask questions that are insightful from out there in the field. So let me go ahead and jump in. I should mention this week, what we're going to be talking about in our deep dive area is sizing battery banks for your residential solar array, which is not as straightforward as you might think. So we'll jump straight in with the news from the solar industry for the week of July 28th. And it's interesting to note that big tech is clearly behind the recent growth in large-scale solar within the United States. In fact, according to a recent report by investment bank UBS, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, and Google, those four firms, account for about 40% of all of the demand from these utility-scale solar arrays that have been installed in the U.S. over the last 5 years. And demand from these companies are expected to just increase as they incorporate AI into their offerings from those companies and other high-tech companies. According to this report, AI requires about 10 times as much electricity as a typical Google search does. So increased demand from these data centers, as well as the adoption of electric vehicles, has led Wells Fargo to project that electrical demand over the next 6 years is going to increase by about 20%. And this is after we've seen a couple of decades of relatively static electric demand here in the US. Most of this increased demand is going to be met through renewable energy or generating sources. The projection from the U.S. Department of Energy are that about 94% of all of the new generating sources all new energy will come from renewable sources in the U.S. this year, and that they will be powered through wind, solar, and batteries. So 94% this year, and that trend's just expected to continue over the coming years. The Texas Tribune is reporting that recent record high temperatures, as well as extreme weather events like the Hurricane Beryl that went through Texas, has led to record adoption of residential rooftop solar in the state of Texas. Texas currently ranks third when it comes to rooftop solar, behind California and Arizona. But when you look at it on a per capita basis, they're actually ranked 20th in the United States. So there's a huge amount of space for this particular sector to grow within Texas. According to a 2018 paper by NREL, they found that about 30% of Texas's electrical demand could be serviced through rooftop solar. Last year, rooftop solar in Texas grew at about a 45% rate year on year, and that was only exceeded by the state of Florida, where they saw a growth of about 47% from 2022 to 2023. The second quarter earnings are out, the financial reports, and a couple of very high-profile companies in this sector are not doing very well. Even though the market as a whole, the sector as a whole, is doing quite well. What we found is that Tesla's second quarter earnings are, I've got somebody here, I'm going to try and mute. There we go. Okay, Tesla's second quarter earnings fell 45% compared to a year ago. Analysts basically blame competition from other EV manufacturing companies like BYD, which is a Chinese company, which is now the largest manufacturer of EVs worldwide. And Enphase saw their earnings drop 57% year on year in the second quarter. And analysts there point to the fact high interest rates, which affect the financing of these systems. But primarily, it's really because of changes in California's net metering laws. And until very recently, California dominated residential solar installation here in the United States, accounting for as much as 50% of all of the systems installed nationwide. And Enphase really dominates the residential marketplace. So what happens in California has kind of an outsized effect on what happens for Enphase. And IREC, which is the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, has announced this week that it's expanding its Charging Smart program into Connecticut and Louisiana. The Charging Smart program is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, and it offers free technical assistance to local governments to help them adopt policies, practices, even to offer incentives as they try and expand EV charging networks and infrastructure within their jurisdiction. Now, the program offers help to these governmental bodies in planning, regulatory development, utility engagement, as well as education and outreach programs to the general public. To this point, the program has only operated within Colorado, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, and then parts of North Texas, Southern California, and Northern Illinois. Review of FERC's, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's data on how our electricity is generated shows that renewable energy, and they define renewable energy as wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, and biomass, but it now accounts for 30% of all of the electrical generating capacity in the U.S. For the 9th month in a row, solar has been the top source of new electric generating capacity. And according to FERC, it's on track within 3 years to be the second largest generating source of power on the US grid. So currently, the way the current mix is solar is tied for 5th with hydro, offering about 6% of the US generating capacity. It falls far behind natural gas at 44%. Nuclear at 18%, coal's around 16%, and wind is at 10%. But within just 3 years, this is going to change dramatically, where natural gas is going to fall to about 40%. Solar is going to be then in second place with 14.5%, followed by coal, which was once king, now dropping to third place at 13.5%. Wind, 13%, and nuclear and hydro dropped down into a tie for 5th place at 7.5%. Quite a change in the generating landscape here, really, in the last decade. And that's pretty much all the news that's been happening here in the past week or so. Does anybody have anything they want to add into that mix that crossed your desk that I have blatantly omitted here in the recap? Give you just a second to pop in. As you're waiting on that, we'll look at some of the announcements of what's happening here in as far as webinars and the like. Well, today, actually, at 2 p.m. Eastern time, there's going to be a webinar on nonprofit ITC direct pay. For those of you who are installing systems and you want to deal with governmental bodies or nonprofit agencies, they can now receive the federal tax credit as a direct pay, as basically a rebate, because in the past, before the IRA, the tax system was such that, if you didn't pay taxes, you weren't able to take advantage of the tax benefits. Now they can. So understand how that works. Then tonight, 7 p.m., a session that's put on by Solar United Neighbors on understanding permitting with a specific focus on the Solar App Plus program that's out there, hopefully expanding dramatically. Also at 7 p.m., the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association has a session on the renewable energy transition. Then we have coal and power plant community issues. This is through a group called Reimagine Appalachia. That's on August 1st. at 2 p.m. And there's another talk from CEA coming up on August 1st at 2 p.m. on consumer protection laws, basically why solar companies should be aware of these. Whole home energy proposals. This is through Solar Power World. This is coming up on August 8th at 2. And then getting Fronius's newest inverter. I watched, I think, a webinar on this just to see what Fronius is up to. It's interesting. It's nice to keep up with what's happening in the world of new product offerings, but I was kind of underwhelmed by the presentation of this. I don't know. I have never used that particular inverter. Okay, August 15th, Equitable Workforce Development. This is put on by, I don't even remember who it is, but you'll find it, Workforce Development. I think it might even be IREC. August 20th, 2 p.m., Drone in a Box with Solar. Apparently, this is a process, a program, or whatever, using drones with your solar project. Always interesting. And then this one is about Selectria, their offerings, their new inverters. I'm sure they're saying it's going to be manufactured in the US, which is why they're focused on the bonus credits from the ITC. Then our shameless plug for our courses that are offered through solarpvtraining.com, online and in person. And then, you know what? The new textbook. Woohoo! Look at this. It's I'll put that in front of the camera. It's actually out. That's sort of the only copy that I've got. We're going to look through and find out all the mistakes we made before we're going into mass public. But this is the 9th edition of this textbook. So just trying to keep everything up to date. That's now compatible with the 2023 code. So that's all good, all progress. Another thing I can put in my obituary, I guess, that I had the 9th one. So okay, so that's the events that are coming up. Anybody want to add anything to that list before we jump into our deep dive there? Give you just a second. Okie dokie. So this discussion topic came about because actually a couple of people have asked me about it over the course of the week. And whenever that happens, I always figure this is a synergy that'll mean that we should start talking about this thing. But if you're gonna design a battery backup that's just there for that operates off the batteries alone, that's pretty straightforward. But how do you deal with it with the fact that your array is going to be generating power also during daylight hours? So that's where it kind of gets more and more complicated here, because you can sit there if it were just the batteries and say, okay, here's our battery bank size. Here are the loads we want to service. How many hours are these loads going to be serviced? And then just divide it into it. And if you've got a 5 kW battery and you've got a 1 kW of load, then it's going to operate for 5 hours. Pretty straightforward. But then when you start talking in about, okay, but I've also got a 10 kW solar array attached to this, and depending on what time of day my loads are going to be operating, that's going to extend that amount of time period, because during daylight hours, the array is going to service the entire amount of those loads. So it gets a little bit more complicated. Not super complicated, but it's something that you want to factor in. And I struggled a little bit in the title of this because I wondered if I should just focus on Enphase, because that's the project that we're working on this week. I decided the same things for Enphase will account for other systems, so I didn't throw that in. So what are our typical systems that you're going to be dealing with? There's in today's market, I think a lot of people think about standalone systems, of course, where you've told the man to stick it, you've gone out into the woods and you built a cabin and you're raising goats and making cheese. And this sounds like my life anyway. But that's not a typical system. That's most systems that incorporate batteries in this marketplace are going to be DC coupled or AC coupled. So you're connected to the grid, your battery is there. but the grid is also present. So there are a lot of advantages of this. And I'm hoping that in the future, there are going to be even more advantages, because what the grid does is it provides connectivity to other consumers, to other people. And just like your telecommunication system, the value of the internet is because of this connectivity. So I'm just hoping that in the future, the electric companies, the electrical industry will understand and begin to develop electrical connectivity services. Not really sure how that's going to evolve or what that's going to look like, but I really feel like the market for that is going to dwarf just the use of power coming through that network. Right now, that's the only purpose of the grid, is to provide power to your home or to your business. I believe in the future, 15 years from now or whatever, getting power from the grid will be a secondary concern. It will be the connectivity of electrical services that will be the dominant economic driver of this interconnected electrical grid that we have. So if you're so inclined and want to go out and become a billionaire, make up some things for this connected electrical thing. And so then that's where we're going to be. So we have DC coupled, we have AC coupled. Typically what you've got with a DC coupled system is you've got an array. It connects into your inverter, and your inverter will often work like it will connect the battery to it as well. So you've got basically two power sources feeding in. One is bidirectional to your battery. Then it could be built into the inverter, could be a separate unit, some sort of auto transformer, some auto disconnect, because your system has to disconnect from the grid if the grid goes down, because you don't want to be feeding power onto the grid when the grid is no longer functioning, known as islanding. All of these inverters are going to have anti-islanding features incorporated into them, which prevents that. So you've got to have some sort of automated transfer switch to disconnect yourself from the grid, and now you're operating in standalone mode when the grid goes down. And you can service all of your loads, or you can service some of the loads. Same thing with an AC coupled system, except that there's going to be essentially two inverters. One takes the DC electricity from the array and converts it to AC. And then you've got to have another inverter that takes that AC electricity and converts it to DC, and then reconverts it back to AC for your critical loads. So this is a conceptual diagram here of what that would look like, and there's some bidirectional. But when we get into the microinverter world with Enphase, for example, here you've got AC generating inverters, microinverters on each panel. It then goes into a combiner box. The combiner box goes to an AC disconnect, which is typically out there next to your meter. And then it's going to connect into your smart switch, your auto transformer. That is what's going to then be the brains of the operation. From the auto transformer, you'll connect into a battery bank. The battery bank there is on the far left, the bottom corner. And the Enphase system, battery banks within these systems, especially with lithium ion, are not just batteries, right? They have battery management systems, charge controlling systems, and in this case, they have small inverters, microinverters built into that battery bank. So your switch is feeding into these microinverters, and they're then converting that to DC for the battery, and then taking from the battery and converting to AC. It then feeds into the smart switch and goes to the critical load panel. And you could have a main load panel, a critical load panel. You could have whole backup, whole house backup, or only critical load. And I know they don't like to use the term critical load anymore. Typically backup load, because I guess somebody got a burr under their saddle about not all these loads are critical. You know, it's like in a hospital, it might be critical, but your coffee maker is probably not a critical load. It's a backup load. Well, For me, it's a critical load, but my garage door opener, not so much, if I had a garage or an opener. But so different things. Now, one thing that I didn't have in that diagram that I probably should have incorporated is load management, because load management is where some of this gets more complicated. The picture here is the Enphase load management device. And you can have up to 2 of these with each of your smart switches. And so it can control 4 to 8 circuits. So in this case, this is showing you what is essentially it's 4 single pole or 2 double pole circuits. And I don't know why they did this in double pole. Maybe because everything's 240 volts. So, but you're not typically going to have 240 volt appliances as part of your critical load backup. If you had a huge system, maybe, and probably the only one's going to be your air conditioner. But in this case, you're going to be operating 2 120 volt circuits. And just splitting these 240 double pole breakers into 2 separate circuits, and they'll feed into your backup load panel. But they are going to operate in tandem, and that's something that you need to understand, because this little system hooks into your smart switch, and the smart switch in there, you can prioritize these loads. So conceptually, what you're dealing with here is you've got 8 loads here, or 4 loads here, but if you had 2 of these boxes, you'd have 8 loads. And you can say, which one do I want to turn off first if I'm running out of power? And then which one do I want to turn off second? And which one do I want to, and so on and so forth. And then which one is the highest priority? And that one you're going to keep on until the very last bit of our power is drained. So you can prioritize those loads. And it's a fairly straightforward system. I've got some pictures of how you manage that a little bit later, but they just feed into these little breakers, and you can test them. You can turn them on and off and the like. And this is down in the basement here of our office. And you can see it's all properly wired in and labeled and all of that. So we're just showing off when we show that. So how do you manage these loads? Well, on your phone, it's going to come in and it's going to say, in this example, you've got a Wi-Fi router, a refrigerator, kitchen lights, and a microwave. I don't know why you picked microwave, but that was their example. So if I want to say, for example, here, the Wi-Fi router modem is going to be manual. And I'll explain what they mean by manual. But there are basically 3 different settings you can set each of these loads to. And other systems are going to be very similar to this. So we're using Enphase as an example here. But you can set it to manual, or you can set it to basic. Basic is, and it's just below there, it says when the grid's connected, this thing is going to be powered. And when the grid is not connected, it's going to be not powered. So it's going to be turned off. Manual, you can set it to be always on, for example. But then you've got a third option, which is scheduled. So scheduled here, for instance, on the refrigerator, they're saying if it's on grid, just keep the load turned on all the time. But if it goes off grid, and when you say off grid, it's basically the grid is down. We're now in off grid mode. You can set up times when this thing should be operating. So in this case, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., we're going to run our refrigerator. And you assume this household does not have a teenage boy living in it, because they would open up the refrigerator and all your cold air would go out regardless of time of day. So you might want to have that operate all the time. So then there's another option here, manual. And manual, in this case, you can either set it to be always powered or always not powered. So I'm a little confused as to when you would pick it to be always not powered. I'm I'm assuming there's an option, and I haven't dug too deeply into this. There's an option where you can program it to be a whole home backup and then select loads to turn off when you go into standalone, as opposed to selecting 8 loads to turn on or to keep on. So I don't want to say that for sure, but that kind of makes sense to me, where you can prioritize which loads you turn off. But I don't, otherwise it just doesn't make sense to me. Some of you guys may have done this, worked with that system, and have a better understanding of it. I've only worked with it where you keep the loads turned on. They're your critical loads. I will just point out, I had a weird thing happen with our system here, where something happened, and I believe it was during a software upgrade. And this is one of the vulnerabilities with these PV systems now that they're getting more software dependent. All of my loads that were critical loads suddenly shut off when the grid was operational. And they were also off, I guess, when the grid went down, but that wasn't the big issue, because essentially they're critical loads for a reason. I want them to be on. And then there's this software upgrade, and then all of my critical loads go off, but all the other loads are functioning just fine. So we ended up having to, it wasn't an easy fix. I had to go in with Enphase, and they had to trip some switches and do some programming, and said, oh, we've never seen this happen before, but I suspect it has. I can't be the only one that ever happened. And there's another option here that's becoming more and more popular, is rather than use like Enphase's proprietary system that does load management, but on a very rudimentary scale, where you're only dealing with like 4 circuits at a time kind of thing, you can go out there and put a SPAN smart service panel in. And now you can begin to manage every single circuit breaker independently. And so that's another way that you can begin to control. I think we're going to see this happening more and more and more. And that's going to just make the whole sizing of battery backups and everything a little more complicated, make the installation a little bit more complicated. So, and certainly more pricey. If you're having somebody swap out a SPAN unit, I don't remember what they cost, but it seems it's multiple thousands of dollars for that process. So, all right, any comments at this moment before I move on here? Everybody's sitting there so quiet. Oh, Bill is applauding. Okay. All right, that was my comment.
That wasn't an applause. It wasn't meant to be an applause.
Oh, you had your hand up.
It was meant to. It was meant to be a hands up. Hey, in the new electrification provisions in the IRA, they are including the cost of upgrading to a new panel. So it may be that would include some of the cost of a SPAN or one of the other smart panels.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And especially if you're, if they're going to pay for 30 or 40% of it, maybe that makes it affordable. Yeah. Al, you've got a question?
Yeah, I put a note in the chat, but I'll get to that later. I want to just talk about my own system at home. I have a 7.2 kilowatt solar panel array, and I installed a battery backup. It's an LG battery, which I think holds like 9.6 kilowatts. And I did it all in 2019. The LG battery failed at the end of 3 years and was still under warranty, so they replaced it. But what I have is a critical loads panel with about 9 circuits. I live in the country, so I have a well water. So one of the circuits is my well pump, and the rest are mostly lights, critical lights, and then my garage door opener. My garage door is extremely heavy and hard to open. So I included the garage as one of the critical loads panels so I can open and close the garage door during a power outage. Pretty important if you want to leave home. And then the other thing I have is all my my routers and modems and that sort of thing in the study where I work with my computers. And so what I consider truly critical loads, and it really has been helpful. I had a situation last year, I think it was last summer, the power went out for 4 days. And I was able to operate with my battery backup during that entire time, partly, as you mentioned, because the sun came out on a couple of those days, which really helped out. And I was surprised how quickly, when the sun was out, my battery recharged. Well, if you're generating 4 or 5 kilowatts, it's going to recharge in about 2 hours. So that's a real consideration in sizing.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, when I was doing research for this, there's a lot of sizing tools out there. And I just kept getting the feeling that they're oversizing your battery bank, because hopefully people will change some of their behaviors when you're in an extended power outage. I think they make the assumption that you're not going to change any behaviors. You're not going to turn off lights. You're not going to, try and ease your way through this period. And I think most people are, at least people who are installing it at this time, are more connected with their system. So,
yeah, I would agree 100%. And really, what you're looking at is, a lot of the real power eaters in a house. For instance, in my case, it's pumping water. So you just you don't take as many showers during the power outage and that sort of thing. You do change your behavior quite a bit. You don't leave the lights on, etc.
I think in most people's experience, the main load that's going to be killing them is their air conditioning. And, we get a lot of people come out to Blue Rock Station and they say, "Oh, you don't have air conditioning. What do you do when it gets hot?" And you're like, "You sweat, it's not that big of a deal." But I think another critical load, and one that we set up here, is the blower mechanism and the thermostat and everything on our furnace, because
Right.
it's a natural gas furnace, but you still need electricity to make it work. So it's,
and I included that as well, and it really works well.
Yeah. And you have refrigerators and freezers, and those are kind of common sense ones. And then you always want to back up some outlet somewhere, whether it's in your kitchen or your office or whatever, where you can plug extension cords in for that particular thing that you just forgot about, the thing that everyone needs. Of course, if you've got teenage kids at home, charging your cell phones is going to be the critical load. So, everything else, who cares? But besides the fact, and in my mind, the reason for putting a battery in, at least in our jurisdiction, the primary reason is the unreliability of the grid. And as Al just pointed out, 4 days without power, a pretty serious thing. Could go out there and get a whole house generator, which a lot of people do, but then you start saying, well, what's the reliability of the of getting fuel when you need it? If we see a very extended outage, for instance, say a Puerto Rico event where a hurricane comes through and you're without power for months at a time, that's definitely not a matter of if, but when and where these kind of things are going to happen. So there's, and also I know there's a neighborhood in Columbus, has really bad electric, and everybody's got these generators, and when the power goes out, it sounds like the Indianapolis 500, it's like all these things, and all these houses are tucked like 3 feet apart, and the whole place smells like diesel fuel, and you're just going, really? This is the best we can do in this society? So, do you have something to add there, Al?
Yeah, I just from a financial standpoint, now this was back in 2019 when I did this, but I got the 30% federal tax credit on the battery as well as the solar panels and the install. And so that brought the price of the battery down to about $7,000, which I figure was comparable to what I would have paid for a whole house generator, or even a critical load generator, frankly.
Yep. And I think we're starting to see this happen more and more. Of course, battery lithium ion is coming down in price. We haven't really seen that extended to the battery banks themselves. The real game changer is going to be when we start to see real industry-wide bidirectional charging for your EVs, because then you've got a massive battery backup in your electric vehicle that you can draw on as the battery backup for your home. So in a case like that, the ideal situation would be to put a very, very small battery in, a fixed battery that's going to deal with those momentary interruptions, the 5-minute power outages, the 10-minute power outages, or whatever. But if you get into an extended power outage, you can plug in your electric vehicle, and then you've just got a massive battery backup to draw on. The issue there has to deal now, the technology is all there, but the protocols, the charging protocols, the warranties on your vehicles, all of those kind of things are delaying this from being a realistic thing. The Ford F-150, the Lightning, they have their own proprietary system. We'll probably see a few of those emerge. What I'm really hoping for is a generic approach where all electric vehicles can be opted in as battery backup on your home, on your businesses. Eventually we'll get to a place where like Walmart is going to be offering, free EV charging out in front of their businesses because they're going to be able to draw on the combined power of all of the cars that are currently plugged in to be not only a battery backup, but to condition some of their power to deal with demand charges, things like that, which sort of leads into the next reason, why do you want batteries on your system? The primary reason, at least in my mind, as I said, is backing up the grid, right? In case you have an outage. That's the one I think that comes into most people's minds. But if you're in an area that has a utility that's starting to dink around with some of their billing practices, for instance, time of use pricing, and that's prevalent in a lot of states where during high demand periods, the price of electricity is much higher. Low demand periods, it's much lower. Well, if you're paying, say, 50 cents a kilowatt hour in the early evening after the sun goes down, and you're paying, let's just say, 15 cents a kilowatt hour in the afternoon when they have ample power, or at night, or whenever, it depends on the profile of that particular location. Well, it just makes sense to store your power either from your solar array or from the grid, and then use that stored power during those periods of high cost electricity. So if you're away from home all day long and your solar array is generating more power than you're using, why are you sending it back to the grid? Why not store it? And then for that evening period from, say, 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock, when electricity is very expensive, drain down your battery, right? Use that power that you've stored, and then do the same thing again the next day. Let it recharge as soon as the sun comes up, and then use it during high cost issues. There's another reason that's coming now, self-consumption, which deals with the fact that utilities are starting to really mess with how much they're willing to pay when you send it back to the grid versus how much you're paying when you buy it from them. So if you're getting a wholesale rate, let's say your local utility says we're only going to pay you 4 cents a kilowatt hour, but we're going to charge you 20 cents a kilowatt hour when we give it back to you. Well, then why are you doing net metering? Why are you sending it back and selling it for 4 cents and then being charged 20 cents? Store it and use it as much as possible. And then if you're in a commercial situation, demand load costs, demand charges can kill you, and the way demand charges work is they charge you a premium based on typically the 15 minutes over the course of the month where you use the most power. And the logic that the utility is giving for that is, okay, if you might use this high amount of power, only for 15 minutes, but we've got to supply you with the infrastructure to support that, even if you're using it for 15 minutes. So let's give you an example where, let's say there's a motor of some sort piece of equipment that has a heavy draw, but it only operates for an hour, every week. You could hook it up where the battery is drained during that period of time, that not directly connected to that motor, but to your system, and draw the power down from your battery bank during that high load period to sort of flatten the demand curve from the grid. You could see serious savings on your electric bill, sometimes cutting your electric bill in half by just doing that, by playing around with when you're using power, not how much power you're using. So those are kind of the main reasons why people are installing batteries, and we're seeing that happen more and more and more. So with the Enphase system here, how do you manage through some of these? Because we've got these different options. So for instance, here with the Enphase, you just go into your app on your phone, and the first option up here is profile. So you would just click on the profile. You can also see some other options. You can set your battery settings, load control. I can prioritize my various loads. I can change my utility rate, which probably changes every day. It's going to go up and up, never goes down. So you can do that. All right. So we jump into this profile mode, and you've got some options here. It's got self-consumption, savings, or full backup. Well, full backup is basically like it sounds. Keep my battery fully charged, and when the grid goes down, I want it available for use. That's what full backup is. So you're not going to be dealing with any of these energy savings in that full backup mode. But for instance, here with self-consumption, for energy savings, it's going to automatically go into time of day price adjustments. So it's going to use the battery when electricity is expensive, and it's going to not use the battery when electricity is cheap. And with this one, and the same thing with the self-consumption, there's a little slide here that says, how much reserve do I want in my battery bank? Do I want 30%, 40%, 50%, 20%, whatever? That's just kind of like your insurance policy that says, all right, let's say I'm in self-consumption mode or I'm in savings mode, and then all of a sudden we have a power outage. That would be the worst of all situations, where you've just drained your battery in order to save some money, and then then the grid goes down. So you want to have some in reserve. So this is it's a very simple way. I'm sure it will get more complicated as people come up with new and innovative ways that they want to control their system. But I just threw those in there just to show you that it's not that complicated on how to manage through these various options. Now, I just saw somebody mentioning about the Enphase battery bank in the chat there. Enphase has transitioned away from, they had like a 3.3 or a 3 kW battery, and then you could get 3 of them that were in a box that were a 10 kW battery system. They've kind of gone away from that, and they're marketing now their 5 kilowatt hour battery. And these things, frustratingly, are not backwardly compatible with various systems. So you cannot take the 5 kilowatt hour battery and hook it into an old system. And the reason for this, it's annoying, but there's a reason, is with this latest generation of Enphase product, they went away from the Zigbee wireless communication system between all of these different components, which apparently had, I'm not that familiar with it, but there was a lot of problems, a lot of issues from a functionality standpoint, interference with other devices, things of that nature. So they decided, for ease of installation, for ease of use, for reliability, we're going to go to a hardwired communication system. So you're just going to run these little communication cables between your battery and your switch, between your combiner box and your switch, and all of these things are going to communicate over wire. Well, that means the old ones don't work because they don't have a place to connect the wire. So with these systems, and I might get the numbers wrong, but they've got like their combiner boxes. They've got the combiner box 3, I think, is their latest one. Might be 4. And then they've got the 3C. The C on the combiner box just means that there's a cellular modem built into it, which is important. Not so much because your modem may fail, but because Enphase won't let you commission the system unless you got one, which is amazingly annoying. But and they cost like another $600 or so if you buy them separately. But when they bundle them in with the combiner box, it's only like another 150 or $200 only. You're spending other people's money when you're doing this. So what the heck? Okay, so we've got the 5 Ps, and they work with the newest system, but just be careful. If you've got an Enphase system and you're convinced you want to go in and do some battery backup, the newer batteries may not be compatible with your older system. So, and who knows how long Enphase is going to be supporting the old threes and 10s. I suspect somebody who's smart is going to have a warehouse full of these things and sell them. All right. So when we do get this 5 kilowatt hour battery, what does the spec sheet look like? Well, there are a few things you want to look at. First off, its output is at 240 volts AC. Well, okay, because it's leaving those microinverters. Excuse me. There's what is its continuous rating? So this is the amount of loads that it's going to be able to handle over time, and that's 3.84 kilovolt amps, or basically watts. But this, for generating purposes, we always deal in volt amps as opposed to watts. Okay, so you can only, when you're sizing your loads at any one time, you cannot run more than 3,840 amps. Or not amps, sorry, watts of load. So now there are surges. Their peak output is about double that for 3 seconds. So those are when you turn on a motor, like on your refrigerator, it's going to spike for just a couple of seconds. It can handle that, but you want to know what is the continuous load functionality of these loads that you're hooking up. And it's only 3,840 watts. That's important when you're figuring out what loads you're wanting to back up. So if you were to throw a air conditioner on this, forget it. On this single battery, it's going to blow it out of the water right off the bat in what its draw is, things of that nature. Okay, so power factor, we'll skip over some of those. Round trip efficiency, these are lithium iron phosphate, which is a very stable architecture. So that's good. They're pedestal mounts. A lot of the things you see in the promotional videos, they always just show these things up on a wall. I don't get it. Unless these guys have some seriously strong walls, and seriously beefy installers who are going to lift this puppy up and hang it on the wall. These things are heavy. So I don't think you want, I think you want it ground mounted. You want it on a pedestal, in your home, your garage, whatever, unless you've built a really solid structure. And one of the issues to raise there is, for instance, in our building, it's in the basement. Well, the basement, could be subject to flooding. So you don't necessarily want this thing down on the ground. You want it raised up enough. So all right, that's some of the things. Well, the other thing is, how many of these can you hook up in essentially in parallel? Well, they're marketing that you can do 4 units or up to 20 kilowatt hours with each of these controllers. So, but with a power control system, which I read to mean something like SCAN, that can limit the power that's coming from it. They're claiming up to 8 units. Getting into that was beyond my pay grade. trying to read through all of that stuff. But I would just say, as a typical residential installation, you're going to be limited to about 20 kilowatt hours, 4 of these units hooked up together. Now, the other thing that was a little bit confusing as I tried to research this, I think it's on the next slide here, is I did find it stated in one place, but I couldn't confirm it in other places, that when you combine them in this fashion, not only does the amount of stored energy increase, but also the amount of power increases. So it sounds like they're hooked up both in parallel and series in that regard, where the 3.84 kilovolt amps is going to increase if you hook 2 together into about 7.6. So you can increase the draw and the load. Somebody in chat just mentioned, I thought you had said that these batteries have to be stored outside in a previous session. And yes, that is true. If you are in a jurisdiction subject to, I believe it's the 2020 code, it might be the 2023, they're integrating in new standards that basically say your storage system in a residential setting or in an occupied setting, there's a whole bunch of issues there that fall into place. So you're going to want to, most of them are saying it's got to be stored outside in a separate building, maybe not even in your attached garage. I saw a video online where the guy was saying in their jurisdiction, if they installed more than like 2 of them in parallel, in their garage, the local municipality required that they install a sprinkler system in their garage, which he thought was very silly because they had an EV parked in their garage that had a battery bigger than this. So they didn't take that into account, but they said because this is, anyway, takes a while for government to catch up on this stuff. I think that this whole thing about taking your batteries outdoors is based on old technology, and is probably not overly workable. So I'm hoping that this is going to be modified in the next round to be more practical, because they're trying to avoid a problem of thermal runaway. Well, this particular architecture of lithium is not really subject to that. You've got EVs that are parked within these buildings that have higher capacity. So it just doesn't make any sense, and it's causing lots of problems. So we'll see how that evolves. But for the moment, check with it. Okay, also remember that these arrays are producing when the sun is shining. So that's something to build in. I'll touch on that here quickly. Another thing to bear in mind, I mentioned about hardwire communication. Black start is an issue with these things. Black start is basically, if you were to run your system all the way down and the battery is empty, well, these units typically require power to start up again. Well, even if the sun comes out and you've got power available at your array, most battery systems may not function because if the battery is all the way dead. So you may not be able to recharge it. So this was one of the things that they're bragging about with Enphase, because their inverters are, they call it grid generating or something like that. They can begin to function. The array in a typical battery system is looking to the battery for power to emulate the grid, and the battery is dead. So the array can't generate because the battery is dead. So that is a difficulty with a battery backup system that you've allowed to go down to zero. So, but with Enphase, because these inverters have self-starting, sunlight only functionality, they're self-generating. All right. So I touched on that about that. Enphase has a few guidelines here. They're saying basically that your battery backup should be twice the size of your array. So if you have a 5 kW array, you want a 10 kilowatt hour battery. If you've got a 10 kW array, they're saying buy a 20. Well, they're just selling you a product. That seems like big for what we're dealing with. It really depends on what your usage. For me, the battery is there to get me through an emergency, not to make sure during that emergency my life is not altered in any form or fashion. So I think they're selling you a product that's big, too big. They do have a sizing tool that you can go in. I found this thing amazingly unhelpful. In some regards, it does allow you to go in and turn on specific appliances and the like and modify it and change it. But the thing I ran in right off the bat is it says, I am new to Enphase, right? And as you start using the product, the next thing before you can even get started is it says, I agree for Enphase to send my contact material to all of their installers so that you're going to start getting all sorts of marketing information. Well, I'm not all that keen on that. So then it said, I'm an existing customer, which I am. So I tried to log in as that. And then it said, all right, which of the systems that you've already put in place are you applying these batteries to? Well, I hadn't put the thing in place. I'm just trying to see what size battery. Well, it wouldn't let me move forward until I would set up the entire system. So I finally just threw up my hands and said, you know what? This isn't very helpful. So you may have a different experience with it. I wasn't impressed. So how do we do the load analysis? Well, if you're just using the battery, if you had a situation like 5 kilowatt hours of load and you have this amount continuous load, that's the power that before breakers start popping and the like. So how would we do this? Well, we do a load analysis. In this case, these are the loads that I want to back up. It amounts to 2560 watts. Well, that's less than my 3840, so I'm good there. It's going to run about 2 hours, right? 2500 watts, 5 kilowatt hours of load. If I were just running off of my battery, that's where I'm at. So if I were running all of these loads at night with no array, going to go about 2 hours. Pretty straightforward. All right. If you want to do whole house backup, they basically say, all right, take the kilowatt hours per day, subtract out the kilowatt hours that are used during daylight hours, and then divide that by 80% to give yourself a safety margin. Here in electric, we love safety margins. So what would be that example? Well, if a typical suburban home uses about 30 kilowatt hours per day, and let's just assume they're using 20 kilowatt hours during sunlight hours, which is not unrealistic because a lot of the power they're using is going to be for air conditioning. During a hot day, you don't need it at night kind of thing. So after I've subtracted out the hours, and getting this number could be not very, could be complicated. How much are you using during the day versus night? But let's say that we're using 10 kilowatt hours consumed at night, divide that by 80%, and we would need a 12.5 kW battery bank. So essentially for whole house backup, you're just saying, I want to only focus on the power I'm using at night, because we will make the assumption that the array was sized properly to service your entire load during daylight hours. So regardless of how much power you're using during the day, the array is going to cover it. Now, that may or may not be true because you might be in the middle of a storm and there's just not that much sunlight. But on a typical day, an average day, it's going to work out. There's no way to actually design these things based on ever-changing weather conditions. But on average, you should be all right there. So that's kind of where I came to. We're right up on time, but I'll throw it open if I've confused anybody. Give you one question here and then we'll jump out if anybody's ready to go. Nope, I must have been very thorough. So anyway, thanks for your attention and we'll see you in 2 weeks over the summer. We're doing this every 2 weeks and then we'll go back to our weekly schedule.